please.
All ready for you. Go for it. Yes. Okay, all yours.
Okay, well, look, thank you for allowing us to come, and I want to give you a brief overview of how I got into this classroom and how Mr. Gardes got into this classroom to speak to y'all. First and foremost, my name is Paige Cortez, and I'm the state senator for Lafayette Parish. I'm one of the state senators. So I'm going to draw you a quick map and give you what I believe to be my, and I'm not a very good artist, okay? So this is Louisiana right here. And then we got the whole United States out here, and that's Florida and all this stuff right here. Okay, so this is Washington, D.C., somewhere around here. And in Washington, D.C., they have a Capitol, and they have a House of Representatives, and they have a Senate, okay? And so in the Senate and the House of Representatives, they have 435 members of the House of Representatives and 100 members of the Senate. In Baton Rouge over here, we have Senate and a House of Representatives. They get confused. A lot of people think, you're the senator, well, don't you go up to Washington, D.C.? No, I go to Baton Rouge. There are 39 senators. I represent 139th of the state of Louisiana. And there are 105 members of the House of Representatives. This is important numbers, and it's not a math class, but you're going to need to know what a majority is and what a supermajority is. And a supermajority is 2/3, generally speaking. You're going to need to know what 3/4 is, because in order to ratify something, you're going to have 3/4 of the states. So let me get somebody to help me with this. Pass these out. If y'all can just maybe grab some of those here and pass them out. Grab some of those there and pass them out. Maybe y'all can you probably have some extras. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little timeline as they're passing these out. Let's think in terms of our country. And by the way, I was a history teacher and a civics teacher years ago, and I loved it. And I was a football coach as well. So I remember very much enjoying every aspect of teaching and coaching. You have minds that are just soaking up knowledge, and so I love being able to give you a little perspective on stuff. So in July 4th, 1776, we declared our independence from Britain. And we said, no longer are we going to let you tell us what to do. The people who signed that declaration, unbeknownst to them, it was going to take 11 years before they actually had a war, fought, died, and then signed another document called the Constitution that actually set up the government of these United States. Well, these United States back then included something about like that, okay? We weren't part of it. We didn't become a part of it until 1812, all right? So think in terms of 1787. In September of 1787, they signed a document. These are both of those documents right here. There's nothing to it. The first document is the Declaration of Independence. It basically says we just declare our independence. It was a real clear, succinct document. The second one was a Constitution. And they had 7 articles in the Constitution, which is what I put down here. And I'm going to leave you, probably when I finish talking, you're going to have way more questions than you got answers for. But to give you an example, we have a Constitution in the state of Louisiana. We've redone it a number of times. The latest one was done in 1974. And it establishes very similar powers, the legislative powers. You all know the legislature, I serve in the legislative branch, has the right to make the laws. The executive powers have the right to carry out the laws, or that's what they're supposed to do. And then the judicial powers are to judge the laws and to see if they're laws that fall in line with the tenets of our Constitution. Okay, there's another article, Article 4, that dealt with the states. Hey man, when you agree to be part of these United States, you still have your independence. You still make your own laws. That's why we have a legislature in Baton Rouge. We make our own laws for the state of Louisiana. But those laws can be subservient to the federal laws. If you want to be a part of this group, you're going to listen to our laws as well, these federal laws. Then you have Article 5 is what we're here to talk about today. And as a former civics teacher, I always knew Article 5 existed, but until Steve Gardes saw me at lunch one day and said, I'd like to speak to you about something that's going on, called the Article 5 movement. And he'll get into that. It gave the premise on how you could change the Constitution. Article 6 established the Constitution as the law of the land, and then Article 7 was how do you go about ratifying the Constitution. They had to determine, once they signed it, how do we get everybody to agree? So they had to go back to these states and say, we need 3/4 of y'all to agree or else it doesn't become law. That still happens today. So, in Article 5, there's two ways to change our Constitution. It's been changed 27 times. The first way is the House of Representatives or the Senate authors a resolution in Washington, D.C., and they have to get 2/3 of them to vote for it. In this case, in the Senate, 2/3 would be what? 67, right? And in the House of Representatives, they need 290 votes to get a resolution passed. They have to do both of those. They have to go through both sides, and then, in order to get it ratified today with 50 states, how many states do they need to have 3/4 ratified? 38 states. Okay, so that's what we're talking about is the only way they've ever ratified it. They said, and I'm going to go through a couple of them. The first one is, the first 10, as you probably all know, are called the Bill of Rights, and they were all pretty much done together. The first one is what we call our freedom of speech. I have First Amendment rights. I have the right to write a letter to the editor that you don't agree with. I have a right to stand up and scream about something you don't agree with. Because people fought for me to have that right and died for me to have that First Amendment right. The Second Amendment right, y'all hear all the time. I have the right to own a gun. Now, we have gun-free zones in this state. You can't bring it on campuses and things like that. You can't bring it into churches. But you do have a right to own it. And you can put it in your car. And if you go get a permit, you have actually the right to carry it concealed. Other than that, you have every right to walk along the street with a gun sticking out of your holster and walk along the street just like the Wild West. That's called your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Okay, the Fifth Amendment is another one you hear all the time in the courtroom. I plead the Fifth. I don't have the right to tell you I broke the law. You have to, I don't have to self-incriminate, and that's one that's used all the time. The next two I find kind of interesting. It's the only time and it's the only amendment that was given to the same topic twice in the history of our United States. It's called Prohibition, the 18th Amendment. I think it's interesting because when I was growing up and Mr. Gardes was growing up, if you turned 18, you could drink alcohol, you could go to war, you could, at the time, we couldn't even vote. I don't know, well, I could vote. You may not have been able to vote at the time. Well, we were kind of out of whack with all those things. Prior to this passage of this amendment, which was in 1919, there was no such laws against drinking. You were 6 years old and your dad wanted you to have a little bourbon, you had bourbon, They finally said during this movement, that's not good for people. Brings out the worst in people. So they repealed the sale or production of alcohol in the United States, and that was the 18th Amendment. That was done in 1919. Well, they realized that people were getting it anyway. They were getting it through these stills and all of these hidden stuff, and that's what they called the moonshiners. They started making it. Well, by 1933, think about that. 14 years later, they said, they made a mistake. They repealed that amendment and said, no, it's okay to sell and distribute alcohol in the United States. 21, that was the 21st Amendment. I remember those because when I was growing up, 18th Amendment was when you were old enough to drink, and then 21 is what it got changed to. Today, the 21st Amendment allows for alcohol sales, and you have to be 21 today in order to drink publicly drink alcohol. The 27th Amendment was the last one passed. Interestingly enough, it was submitted as one of the first 10 amendments, part of the Bill of Rights, but it didn't get ratified. And you know what it says? It says if you serve in Congress, you can't give yourself a raise until after it's time for you to leave. Pretty good idea. It was a novel idea back in the 1790s, but we never passed it till the 1990s. 200 years later. So, the 2/3 of Congress, 67 and 290, can make a resolution. They don't have to go to the president. They make a resolution, and they send it to the legislatures of all the states. And if 3/4 of the legislatures of all the states decide that it's good enough, then it becomes ratified. It becomes part of that document called the Constitution. And no judge can strike down something that says is legal in the Constitution. What's the other way? The other way is called, in Article 5, the Convention of States. And that's what Mr. Gardes is going to talk about. If 2/3 of all the state legislatures, meaning me, pass by 2/3 resolution, each house. They can call on their own 34 states, 2/3 of the states, because if we talk about there's 50 states and we want to get 2/3 of them, that's a 34. If we got 50 states and we want to get 3/4, that's 38. So if 34 states pass a resolution that says we shall call a convention to introduce a resolution or an amendment, excuse me, a constitutional amendment, then we can do it without, we don't need Washington to tell us we can do that. We can do that without. So, has it ever been done? No. It's never been passed that way. So the second way to do this would be historic. And if all 30, if you get 34 of the 50 states to call that convention, it would be historic. How do you go about calling it? Well, I was asked by Mr. Gardes in our meeting, he said to me, I would like you to file the resolution. I would like you to be the author of the resolution. I said, okay, tell me more about it. What do you want? He told me more about it. And I said, Steve, with all due respect, I will do it if you ask me. That's my job to represent you. But we're not going to pass a resolution through the Senate committee and through the full Senate and through the House committee and through the House, just you and I. It's going to take a lot more than that. I mean, I'll file it, but it could be dead on arrival if members of the committee don't agree with it. You need some firepower. And I said, let's think this through. It may take 12 years to get the convention called or to get the amendment adopted. And then to get it ratified and go back to the states, 20 years, 30 years. I said, you and I might be dead by then. Why do we even want to put our efforts into it? And he said, you're right. He's 66 years old, Steve?
67.
67 years old. He said, you're right, 20 years? I'll be 87 years old. I don't know that necessarily we're doing it. But then he said, you know, something to the extent in our conversation, what do you think those founding fathers thought when they had, you know, when they wrote We the People, you know, when they started writing that, were they writing it for themselves or were they writing it for the future? And so he and I came up with this idea. I said, why don't we introduce this to some civics classes and see if they would be willing to take a challenge, come to Baton Rouge, and be part of the political process of passing a resolution, sitting in front of a committee and saying, this is why you need to do it. I'm the future of the United States. I'm the future of Louisiana. In 20 years, y'all are going to be 37, 38 years old. We're going to be old, but you'll be right in your prime. And do you want the United States of America to be what it is today, or do you want to think it can be better? Do you think it could be better if we changed and added some amendments to the Constitution? So with that, that's the challenge I posed to Steve Gardes, and he has given speeches to the Beavers Club and to a lot of these different, I said, you talking to the same old guys. Why don't you come talk to the next generation? So he said, I think I will. So that's what brought us here today. And so for Mr. Cannon, thank you for allowing us to be here, and all the administration. We appreciate it, and I appreciate your attentiveness. And I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and I'll be around for the whole show. At the very end, if you have questions, we'd be happy to answer them. I will tell you this, you'll have more questions tomorrow and the next day, so Mr. Cannon can get in touch with you. Steve, it's all you.
Thank you, Senator Cortez, and I accept your challenge. So my task today is to convince you guys that we got serious problems, serious enough that warrants amending the Constitution. And I think the best way to approach this is to go back to the very beginning. You know, why did our founding fathers want a federal government that was not too powerful? How, in spite of all the checks and balances that they put in the Constitution, that they still feared that this day may come. And how they put a provision in the Constitution that for 229 years, we the people, the states, have never used this before. As Senator Cortez told you, all 27 amendments that have been made to our Constitution has been done by Congress. Understand that if we fail to pass this resolution today, it's not going to have any effect on me or my generation. We'll most probably be gone before all hell breaks loose. But you guys, you'll be right in the middle of the storm if things don't perhaps change course. And that's why I'm here to talk to you today. Many experts have been saying really since 2012, 4 years ago, that we're headed for a crisis unless we change course. Here we are today, 2016. We haven't changed course yet. And so it's because of that, it's my opinion, especially after talking to Senator Cortez, that you guys should have a seat at the table today. And so, with that being said, let's get started. So again, Senator Cortez told you that in 1776, we passed the Declaration of Independence. Let me read some of the specific things that our founding fathers said in that document that you most probably have heard before, but for purposes of today, it's important. It says, all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. To prove this, let facts be submitted, which they did, and then they close by saying, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, do declare that we are independent and absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. As Senator Cortez told you, it took 11 years for us to fight the American Revolution and then come up with the Constitution in 1787. And in there, the 5th article, which is the main topic of today's discussion, is how we amended. They came back, and this is very important for you, the Bill of Rights 4 years later. Okay, so they came back and they said, we want to pass the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. Okay, and the reason for that was that they wanted to clarify exactly what rights we the people had retained, such as freedom of religion and the right to bear arms. And the 9th and 10th Amendments, okay, they talk about those rights and powers given to the U.S. government were limited, that they should not be construed to deny the rights retained by the people, and that the people retained all rights not specifically delegated to the U.S. government. Now, drafting the Constitution in 1787, they had they warned us of 4 issues, and these 4 issues are still very relevant today. Okay? Benjamin Franklin said, the love of power and the love of money drives man. Place before man post of honor that shall at the same time be a place of profit, and they will move heaven and earth to obtain it. In 1913, Congress passed for the first time the power to lay and collect taxes on the income of the taxpayers. Okay, so you've all heard about income taxes. Well, realize this, we went the first 125 years of our government with no income taxes until 1913. Funny thing happened after that. Washington had become a place of profit, and they will move heaven and earth to obtain it. Thomas Jefferson said, I strongly dislike the abandonment of the principle of rotation of office. Back in the day, that's what they called term limits. The Founding Fathers talked about term limits, but they were so preoccupied with getting the right structure between the federal government and the states. Keep in mind, we were leaving the monarchy of the King of Great Britain, okay? So they definitely didn't want to get back into that trap again, all right? But once Washington became a place of profit, a funny thing happened. All of a sudden, our congressmen started establishing permanent residences in D.C. Did you know that today there is more turnover in the Soviet Politburo than there is in the United States Congress? Think about that. James Madison said, "We should not create laws so voluminous that they cannot be read or so incoherent that they cannot be understood." Senator Cortez showed you how small the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence was. This small book has the 13 greatest documents and speeches of the United States, which includes those two documents, plus George Washington's first inaugural address, George Washington's farewell address that we'll talk about today. Those 13 documents are all in this book. See this stack of papers right here? This almost represents the Affordable Care Act of 2010. Some people call it Obamacare. I say almost because actually I'm about 200 pages short, but I ran out of paper. This is all one bill, okay? Finally, George Mason said, you know, the plan, the Constitution that we're forming today, surely we're not going to get it right. There's going to need to be some amendments. And here's the critical thing that they talked about. And they said, you know, it would be improper to require the consent of the federal legislature because they may abuse their power and refuse their consent on that very account. So that's how they came up with, you know, when we do Article 5, we got to have a second way, a way where the states themselves can amend the Constitution without requiring the approval of Congress or the President. Okay? So, and that's what in fact happened. So as you can see, our founding fathers were very concerned that someday our federal government may take on too much powers, become out of control, if you will. I would like to now show you a video of the Article 5 process on how the states can go about amending the Constitution.
The United States Constitution was written to form a more perfect.
So, why after 229 years are the states now trying to amend the Constitution? Remember some of the concerns expressed in the Declaration of Independence? Has the government become destructive of the rights of we the people? Remember the concerns expressed in the Bill of Rights. Has the government assumed more rights than the limited ones that were delegated to them? Today, many citizens do feel that the government has assumed too many rights and are in fact bypassing the Constitution. So the complaints are many. We actually don't have time to talk about all of them, but I'm going to talk about most probably what I think are the four most important. Freedom of religion. We'll start there. Did y'all know that the founding fathers built this nation on a faith in God? In 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin proposed that each day begin with prayer. Slide number 4 that we're getting ready to show is actually the, oops, let's go one more slide. This is an article that appeared in the New York Daily Advisor a week before the first inauguration of President George Washington and the first Congress. Okay? And you notice what's underlined? It says that they were going to convene in the house of God and commit the new government to the holy protection and blessing of the Most High. And in his inaugural address, President George Washington said that God has been pleased to favor the American people in deciding on a form of government. And then he and the first Congress walked a couple of blocks down, and this is in New York City. Washington, D.C. hadn't even been formed yet. And they went to St. Paul's Chapel. And that's where they did, in fact, commit the new government to the holy protection and the blessing of the Most High. In his inaugural address, Washington also said this: "No people can be bound to acknowledge the invisible hand more than those of the United States. Every step by which we've advanced to an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency." So, there you can see it. Now, even in our money, we see "In God We Trust." That's on our money, all right? It's also on the capstone of the Washington Monument. The Ten Commandments. That's engraved in bronze on the floor of the National Archives in Washington, where the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution are displayed. The First Amendment of the Constitution that Senator Cortez discussed with you said that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Yet, in the last 50 years, some of our political leaders and judges have slowly and steadily outlawed references to God, religious symbols, and even public prayer. For example, the Ten Commandments, they can no longer be shown at a public school. Have you also noticed that public prayer is no longer allowed at high school football games or in graduation ceremonies? Is America turning away from God? Does that sound like a problem to you? How can this be when the First Amendment specifically states that Congress shall make no law that prohibits the free exercise of religion? The second complaint. Only Congress has the power to make laws. Article 1 of the Constitution says, and I quote, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States." Article 2 of the Constitution says, "The executive power shall be vested in the President. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed, and he shall also take an oath that he will, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." So, Congress is supposed to make the laws, and the President is supposed to only execute the laws and defend the Constitution. Did you know over the last 10 years, and during this period of time, we had both Republican and Democrat leaders of our government at that period of time, the executive branch has issued 37,000 executive orders, rules, and regulations, most of which had fines or penalties, or you can even go to jail if you did not adhere to those laws. Now, the executive branch, you say, well, who's the executive branch? Although the President, he appoints different departments. So you have the EPA, the Department of Energy, the Department of Labor, the Department of Justice, HUD, etc., etc., etc. And these are the departments that are issuing all of these rules and regulations now. 37,000 of them. During that same period, you know how many laws Congress submitted to the President for signature? 1,700. So who's making the laws today? Is it really the President and the executive branch? Or as it is Congress? Congress is the only one that the Constitution gives the right to make laws, to legislate. Does this sound like a problem to you? Remember the Declaration of Independence? And I quote, "The history of the present king is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. To prove this, let facts be submitted. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent bitter swarms of officers to harass our people, to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution, for altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever." Is it possible that 240 years later, we're having some of the same problems that our founding fathers had with the King of Great Britain? The third complaint. The United States has immigration laws that says immigrants must come here in a legally approved manner. Did you know that today there are over 5 million illegal immigrants here, and the executive branch will not allow them to be deported? In fact, the President has issued an executive order that's called DAPA, which not only shields them from deportation, but makes them eligible for a driver's license, Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicare, health care, education for their children, tax credits, and other benefits. Did you know today that 26 states has filed a suit against the federal government? It's due to be heard in the Supreme Court this summer. And the reason why they filed this suit is because of the high cost that they are having to incur in providing all of these benefits to these illegal immigrants. Does this sound like a problem to you? Remember the Declaration of Independence? The history of the present king is a history of repeated injuries. He has refused his assent to laws. He has obstructed the laws for naturalization of foreigners. Laws of immediate and pressing importance are suspended in their operations till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. Is it possible that 240 years later, we are having the same type of problems that our founding fathers had with the king? The fourth complaint. Treaties require 2/3 approval by the U.S. Senate. Article 2 of the Constitution says, and I quote, "The President shall have power by and with advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators concur." Did you know that this summer, a couple of months ago, the President signed a nuclear agreement with Iran without getting the consent of the U.S. Senate? Did you know that this fall, Iran violated the terms of the nuclear deal by conducting not one, but 2 tests of ballistic missiles? Missiles that can deliver a nuclear bomb to the United States? Did you know that 2 weeks ago, the President went ahead with the nuclear deal anyway, and we sent over $100 billion of cash to Iran? Does this sound like a problem to you? Remember the Declaration of Independence. The history of the present king is a history of repeated injuries. He has refused his assent to laws. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their act of pretended legislation, for suspending our own legislature and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. Again, is it possible that 240 years later, we're having the same problems? If so, recall what our founding fathers also said in the Declaration of Independence. It is the right of the people to alter or abolish such a form of government. That is their right. It is their duty to throw off such a government. Perhaps more concerning, to me at least, than these complaints is the final warnings that George Washington gave us in his farewell address in 1796. He gave us 3 warnings that I thought were really important. First one, and I quote, "Inspire caution in those entrusted with the country's administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The consolidation of the powers of all departments into one creates a real despotism." His second warning, "Of all the habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. The national morality cannot prevail without religious principle." And his third and final warning, which is very important to me as a CPA, "As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. Use it sparingly as possible, avoiding the accumulation of debt, not ungenerously throwing it upon prosperity and burden which we ourselves ought to bear." What that last phrase means, translated, is that we should not be piling up a whole bunch of debt and expecting you guys and your kids to have to pay for it. Did you know that our national debt has more than doubled in the last 7 years, from $9 trillion to $19 trillion? What does 19 trillion mean? If you Google the U.S. debt clock, you will see that that translates to $159,000 of debt for every taxpayer in the United States. $159,000 is their share. I'm a taxpayer. 7 years ago, my share of the debt was only $75,000. In 10 years, you guys are going to be taxpayers. And if we don't change course, your share of the debt could be about $250,000. Our federal debt to GDP ratio has increased from 38% to 74% during that period of time. Here's the critical part. Studies have shown that when that ratio exceeds 80%, the debt can smother economic growth and send countries into a death spiral. 80%. We're at 74% today. So what do you think? Has there been an encroachment of power by the executive branch? Is America losing its religion and morality? Have we run up too much debt? Does America need to change course? In closing, I'd like to finish a story that I was telling you a few minutes ago. Remember how George Washington and the first Congress went to St. Paul's Chapel to pray allegiance to God and ask for His holy protection? Well, if you Google the miracle of St. Paul's Chapel or the miracle of 9/11, you will find that that church is located at ground zero, where on 9/11 the Twin Towers fell. In fact, the land that the Twin Towers were built on used to be church property back in the day. You will also learn that St. Paul's Chapel was the only building in that area that was not damaged on 9/11, even though it was directly across the street. They call it a miracle. Remember also that America's first inauguration took place several blocks away at the Federal Hall. Did you know that when the Twin Towers fell, a shock wave opened up cracks in the foundation of the Federal Hall? You can Google that as well. Do you see the picture? America's ground of consecration has now become ground zero. The church where our first president and Congress pledged allegiance to God and asked for His hedge of protection was miraculously untouched. But the building where our government was originated, its foundation was cracked. When President Washington was delivering his first inaugural address at Federal Hall, he gave us this prophetic message concerning America's future. And I quote, "The propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself hath ordained." So this begs two questions. Has America started to disregard the eternal rules of order and right? Has God started warning us to change course? So, what do you guys think? Does America have any problems? Does America need to change course? Understand that communication is the key to solving all problems. I don't care whether it's in marriage, in business, in government. Communication is the key. The first step in the Article 5 process is to have a convention where the states can get together and start talking about America's problems. So if you guys think that America has some serious problems and that the adults should get together and start talking about it, then I would suggest that you request Senator Cortez to pass a resolution calling for a convention of states under Article 5 and let the discussions begin. If you do, you will no longer just be studying American history. Instead, you guys could become part of American history. Senator Cortez, the floor is yours.
So, I guess the question that I would have if I were in your shoes, and I'm going to ask you for your questions, is what can I do? What can someone sitting in this classroom do? And why would I want to do it? That's the first two questions I would have for me if I were sitting in your shoes. Well, number one, you can come up with probably 10 things in your mind that you'd like to change at the government. And that's not what we're really here talking about. What we're talking about is you may have some things that you would change, and you might have some things that would be totally opposite to what he would want to change. But you can't even talk about it until you call this convention. So what does it take practically to call a convention in the states? I can file a resolution. Remember I told you there are 39 senators and 105 House members. That's 144 members of the Louisiana legislature. Each one of us has the authority to file a bill or a resolution. Then it goes to the committees, and the public comes to testify on why they think it would be a good idea to pass it or why they think it would be a bad idea to pass it. If it goes to the Senate resolution, it would go to the Senate committee. And there's 7 members on that Senate committee. Seven or 9? 9 members. If you get a 5-4 vote in your favor, it goes to the floor. You get a 5-4 vote against you, dead. Well, I'm telling you, I'm here to tell you, having sat at those committees, when a group of high school students come and sit and testify at that table and say, Mr. Senator, I'm here on behalf of this bill because I think it would be better for this state and for the United States if you pass this out. And I'm going to ask you why. As a senator, I would say, why are you here? Tell me what you believe. And if you said nothing more than because Washington's broken, because they vote Republicans against Democrats and Democrats against Republicans, and they never really sit down in a room and talk about it. And maybe, just maybe, if I told you that there are guys that are serving in the United States Congress, the longest serving member right now has been serving for 51 years. I already told you I'm 54 years old. I was 3 years old, and I'm an old dude when that guy got elected. You think things have changed? And he was serving when you didn't even have anything but a dial phone. There was no such thing as cable TV. You had to have antennas, and there were 3 stations. That's when he got elected. You guys have never lived when there wasn't 250 channels on TV and a cell phone in everybody's hand. He didn't have a phone in his hand when he got elected. Didn't even have a phone maybe in his own house. So that's what would turn the meter. If he and I go to the table, it's going to be a 5-4 vote or a 6-3 vote, one way or the other, and they were going to say, next bill. But if you fill that auditorium with a bunch of high school and college students who say, this is my country, and I'm here to make a change, there will be some people over here that would say, wait, what are y'all doing here? They're going to wake up in committee, and they're going to say, you come to the table. You know, you fill out your card. You don't have to come to the table, but if you're just there, you fill out a card that you're in favor of it or you're opposed to. When you get to the table and you answer a question eloquently, that it's your country, they got to stand up and say, you know what? It took a lot of gall to come here. So, questions?